The following is the medieval chronicler Henry of Huntingdon telling his version of the death of Earl Godwin, who died whilst feasting with Edward the Confessor. When Edward was feasting at Windsor, where he often used to stay, his father in law, the traitor Godwin, was lying next to him, and said, "It has frequently been falsely reported to you, king, that I have been intent on your betrayal. But if the God of heaven is true and just, may he grant that this little piece of bread shall not pass my throat if I have ever thought of betraying you." But the true and just God heard the voice of the traitor, and in a short time he was choked by that very piece of bread, and tasted endless death. A colourful version of events then, but as is often the case with Henry of Huntingdon, not totally accurate, although Godwin had indeed been dining with the king when he fell fatally ill. However, rather than choking on a piece of bread, Godwin was in fact stricken by a stroke. After lingering for a few days, Godwin eventually died, bringing to an end the life of one of the most powerful men in 11th century England. How Edward the Confessor would have felt at the Earl's passing probably would have resembled something close to relief. Godwin and his sons were an overbearing presence in Edward's kingdom, and the king had tried to rid himself of this nuisance of a family to which he was bound through his marriage to Edith, Godwin's daughter. In 1051, an opportunity to extract himself from Godwin's control had arisen for the king when trouble broke out in Dover. Eustace, Count of Boulogne, who was married to Edward's sister, had visited England, and he and his retinue were attempting to stay in Dover when the locals became unhappy at these rather presumptuous visitors who felt entitled to take lodgings wherever they pleased. A violent fight broke out, with perhaps 30 or 40 men killed, with a good number more injured. Eustace complained to the king, and with Edward seeking to avoid upsetting his brother in law and also a potential diplomatic embarrassment, he ordered Earl Godwin to ride to Dover and lay the law down to the locals. Godwin, however, refused to accept Eustace's version of events and instead took the side of the people of Dover. Tensions grew between the king and Earl until Godwin was eventually ordered into exile. However, the exile of Godwin and his sons would not last long, and they would return the following year in 1052. Edward's hostility to Godwin was deep rooted and perfectly natural. In 1036, acting on behalf of Harold Harefoot, Godwin's men had ambushed a party led by Edward long before he had become king, and his brother Alfred, who had returned to England from Normandy after decades in exile. Though Edward slipped through Godwin's clutches, Alfred was seized, and his eyes were put out in grotesque fashion. So violent was his blinding that Alfred died shortly after. Little wonder, then, that Edward's relationship with the Earl was so uneasy. For Godwin's part, it must be said that a king may well be inclined to mistrust him for reasons beyond the power he wielded. He was clearly a man who followed the way the wind blew. In 1035, King Canute died after a successful reign. Canute had built an empire known as the North Sea Empire, containing England, Denmark, and Norway. The inheritance of England and Denmark would not be an easy one to govern, and Canute's son, Harthacnut, had problems maintaining peace in Denmark, with King Magnus of Norway making war against him. This prevented Harthacnut from sailing to England, which his father had, with luck, conquered in 1016. As a result, another of Canute's sons, Harold Harefoot, Harthacnut's half-brother, took the role of regent of England for the absent Harthacnut, or so Harold Harefoot would have you believe. It soon became clear that Harold was in fact not acting as regent at all, but as king, and it seems that Godwin had recognised that trouble was brewing. He rejected the idea of Harold taking such a position, and held out as long as he could. But the problem for Godwin was that there was still no sign of Harthacnut, who remained in Denmark. Without him, there was little that could be done, and by 1036 it seems that Earl Godwin was now very much Harold Hereford's man, as we've seen with the terrible murder of Alfred Aisling. Godwin's dramatic death came in the spring of 1053. The Earl was a man of his time. He would do what he needed to maintain his status as one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Over the course of his career, he was a rather unsettling presence behind the English crown. For Edward the Confessor in particular, Earl Godwin must have seemed to be some sort of phantom that wouldn't leave him be. Indeed, even after the Earl's death in 1053, his spectre lived on in the king's mind. After all, Edward had no heir, and who better to succeed him but Harold Godwinson?